recording studio from members of the church, and a group of our church literally wrote our church's song. And the people at the recording studio kind of polished it up and finished it up, so that was like the last 20 seconds of the song, but we'll get that out there for everyone. We're actually putting it on Spotify, and it's going to be out there. It's going to be a thing, so it'll be kind of fun. So with that, let us open up with a word of prayer to start off. God of road and refugee, you who move in dreams and whisper in the night, be near to all who are forced to flee, those who leave their homes behind, not by choice but necessity. Give us eyes to see your presence in the frightened parent, in the vulnerable child, in the stranger crossing borders in hope and fear. Trouble our comfort when it forgets compassion. Strengthen our courage when love demands action. And guide us as you guided that holy family long ago, to choose the path that protects life, honors dignity, and makes room for mercy. Amen. Now, this is going to be a big surprise for you guys, but we're going to do something a little different today. And for the visitors, the reason they're laughing is it's always different. A sermon from me is like a box of chocolates. You're never going to know what you're going to get here. But instead of the typical analysis and explanation, we're going to begin today with story. A familiar story, but one whose details are often rushed by, simplified, or quietly reshaped until the story becomes comfortable for us. Every year after Christmas, we hear the biblical account of foreign visitors, sorcerers who come searching for Jesus. But the actual story is remarkably short, barely 10 verses, almost seemingly unfinished. And not only is the story brief, it's often remembered incorrectly. The Bible never tells us there were 3 visitors. The Bible never says they were kings. The Bible never places them at the manger on Christmas. What Matthew actually describes is an unknown number of foreign sorcerers who visit a toddler Jesus living in a house in Bethlehem, long after shepherds have gone home and the stable disappears from our view. Yet somehow, what we hear instead is some kind of a neat, sentimental scene. Every year, the preacher reads this from the Bible, and our brain translates it: 3 kings, a newborn baby, silent night, a version of the story that feels safe, it feels familiar, it feels manageable. But that's not the story that Matthew tells. So today, we're going to slow down that story. We're going to take those 10 verses and we're going to let them breathe. We're going to fill in the gaps, not to change the story, but to hear the story more honestly. My hope is that we'll have a deeper appreciation for what Joseph, Mary, and Jesus endured. And just as importantly, we'll recognize something else, that this is a refugee story. And once we hear it that way, it becomes impossible to unhear it. So let's tell the story again, carefully, honestly, and without softening those parts that were never meant to be easy. So now let's listen with fresh ears to the story of Jesus and his flight to Egypt. By the time the visitors arrived, the family no longer were living on borrowed straw. They now have walls, a door, a roof that doesn't leak. Joseph finally found work, nothing glamorous, nothing permanent, but enough. Mary knows the neighbors by name now. The child has learned the rhythm of the streets, the sound of the carts, the bark of the dogs, the way the dust settles in the afternoon. Jesus is almost 2 now, old enough to run, old enough to laugh loudly, and old enough to ask why. This is not a newborn story anymore. It's a settled story. And that's what makes what comes next so devastating. The visitors. The visitors come in daylight. Foreign men, strange clothes, skin tone and accents that don't match the region. They smell faintly of incense and long roads. The neighbors notice. People always notice outsiders when they don't belong. Joseph noticed immediately that these are not priests. They carry no scrolls, no temple authority. What they do carry are instruments, charts, symbols, objects that suggest they read the world differently. Star readers, diviners, sorcerers, some would say. Men who watch the sky and believe it speaks. They enter the house and they bow. Not to Joseph, not to Mary, but they bow to the child. That alone should have been enough to make Joseph uneasy. Why are these strangers coming in and bowing to my child? They ask questions carefully, the way people do when they know they're already involved in something a little dangerous. We followed signs, one of them said. They don't say, God told us. They say, the world shifted. They bring gifts. Gifts that are a little excessive for a carpenter's household. Gold? That doesn't make sense. Frankincense, that's meant for sacred spaces. Myrrh, that's a burial spice, dark and heavy and wrong for the toddler's hands. Mary feels it before she understands it. This visit is not about honor. It's a warning. They stay longer than expected, long enough for Joseph to notice how often they kept glancing towards the road, long enough for Mary to see them speaking in hushed tones whenever they thought no one else was listening. Finally, one of them pulled Joseph aside. We went first to Jerusalem, he says quietly. Joseph's stomach drops. Of course you did, Joseph said, because that's where you'd go if you were looking for a king. There's interest, the man said carefully. There's interest from the palace. Joseph feels the word palace like a blade. Another sorcerer joins in. Herod asked questions. What kind of questions, Joseph asked? The men exchanged looks. The kind of question rulers ask when they feel threatened. That night, the Magi do not sleep well. Neither does Joseph. And somewhere in the dark, through dream or intuition, or something Joseph will never have a language for, clarity arrives to Joseph without comfort. Staying is no longer an option. By morning, the Magi are gone. They leave without returning to Jerusalem. They leave without explanation. They leave behind a truth Joseph cannot unknow. Herod knows about the child, and Herod does not share power. Joseph looks at the walls he built with his own hands, the routine he fought so hard for, the fragile sense of normacy that they carved out of chaos. Then he looks at his son, barefoot, laughing, utterly unaware of what kings do when they're afraid. And Joseph understands something refugees understand immediately. Safety is temporary. You never lose it all at once. You lose it in moments when information changes, when rumors solidify, when the math no longer works. Joseph wakes Mary. We have to leave, he says. Mary looks around the house. How long do we have? Joseph doesn't answer. Because the truth is, they're already late. They leave under the cover of darkness. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's practical. They take what they can carry. The gold helps. And the irony is not lost on Joseph. Foreign sorcerers funded their escape from the Jewish king. Jesus doesn't understand why he can't bring everything. Why his favorite cup stays behind. Why his mother holds him a little tighter than usual. Jesus cries once loudly. Joseph freezes. Mary hums until the sound passes. They do not use main roads. They move like people who know that being seen is dangerous. Every shadow looks like a soldier. Every sound feels like pursuit. This is not a holy procession. This is an evacuation. Egypt is not chosen because it's ideal. It's chosen because it's away. It's away from Herod's jurisdiction. It's away from the palace, away from soldiers who follow orders without asking. Crossing the border does not feel triumphant. It feels humiliating. Joseph cannot speak the language very well. Mary knows that they're always going to sound like foreigners here. Their child will grow up with an accent that marks him as other. They're not welcomed as heroes. They're tolerated as survivors. Sometimes that's the best you can hope for. Then the news comes later. It always does. Herod has ordered the death of children in Bethlehem, 2 years and under. Not because he knew which child to target, but because terror is easier than precision. Mary collapses when she hears. Joseph turns, fists clenched, unable to look at his hands without imagining what they were just spared from. They survive. Others do not. And this is the part of the Christmas story that rarely makes it into the Christmas carols we sing. Jesus lives because other children die. Not because that's fair, not because that's holy, but because that's how empires behave when they're threatened. Within the first year of exile, Herod dies. But the danger doesn't disappear, it just relocates. Joseph learns that they can go back, just not all the way back. Not to Bethlehem, where he built that house. Not Judea. Too close to power, too close to memory. So they settle in Nazareth, a place people dismiss, a place no one expects greatness from, a place where a refugee child can grow up unnoticed. And that, perhaps, is the most honest ending of all. The story is not metaphor, it's not symbolic, it's not spiritualized safety. The Holy Family were plain and simply political refugees, fleeing state violence, crossing borders, dependent on foreign generosity, raising a traumatized child in exile. And if this is true, then every refugee story today echoes Christmas more closely than we're often comfortable admitting. So now the story has been told honestly, in great detail. And once you hear it this way, there's no responsible way to simply admire the story and move on with your life. Because this story does not end in Egypt. The story ends here, with us. The question Matthew leaves hanging in the air is not what did Joseph do? That part is clear. The question is, what do we do now that we know who Jesus was before he ever preached a sermon, healed a soul, or spoke a parable? before Jesus teaches love thy neighbor, before Jesus speaks of mercy, before Jesus challenges empire. Jesus lives as someone displaced by empire. That matters. Because faith doesn't begin with belief, faith begins with recognition. And once you recognize Jesus in this story, certain things become harder for us to ignore. It becomes harder to talk about refugees in some abstract way, harder to reduce human lives to statistics or talking points, harder to separate biblical values from those real bodies crossing the real borders under real threat. The story tells us that the first people to protect Jesus were not the religious authorities, not kings, not an army, but frightened parents guided by outsiders, acting quickly, imperfectly, and without guarantees. This meant that the Holy Family survives not because the system worked, but because someone chose compassion over compliance. Which brings us to us. Most of us will never have to flee the night with a child in our arms. Most of us will never have to leave our homes behind knowing that we may never return. But all of us will face moments when safety and comfort come at the expense of someone else's humanity. Moments when fear whispers, "This is not your problem." Moments when convenience tells us to just look away. Moments when tradition urges us, just don't complicate things. Tell the story the way it's supposed to be told. The story of the flight into Egypt asks us simply some unsettled questions. When safety is at stake, whose safety really matters to us? Because here is the truth we often avoid. Empires don't just exist out there. Empires exist wherever fear is weaponized, wherever power seeks to protect itself, wherever certain lives are deemed expendable for the sake of order. And the gospel does not ask us to pretend it isn't happening. The gospel asks us to decide where we stand when it does. This is not about politics, it's about proximity. Who do we allow ourselves to see as fully human? Whose stories are we willing to hear without immediately qualifying them? Whose suffering moves us from sympathy to action? Matthew does not tell us what Egypt was like for Jesus as a child. We don't know how long that fear lasted. We don't know how long the memories followed him back to Nazareth. But we do know this. Jesus' earliest experience of the world was shaped by vulnerability, displacement, survival. Which may be why later in life, Jesus seemed to notice those people who are overlooked. Why Jesus speaks so often about children, strangers, poor, the outcast. Why Jesus does not romanticize suffering, but also refuses to ignore the suffering. The story reminds us that compassion is not an abstract virtue. It's a practiced discipline. It looks like choosing curiosity over judgment, listening before reacting, learning names instead of repeating labels, advocating not because it's easy, but because it's faithful. And here's where the story becomes deeply personal. We do not have to solve the refugee crisis to live in the story. We do not have to carry guilt of the world's suffering, but we are invited quietly and persistently to ask where our sphere of influence intersects with someone else's vulnerability. Who crosses your path this coming week? Think about that as you go into the week. Who's going to cross your path who feels unsafe, unseen, who feels tired of having to explain their worth. Sometimes faith happens in these grand, courageous gestures, but more often, faith is small, consistent acts of decency that resist fear's pull. A conversation where we refused dehumanizing language. A donation that cost us a little something. A willingness to sit with complexity instead of demanding simple answers. Joseph did not know how the story would end when he fled to Egypt. He only knew that staying would cost his child his life. That is often how faith works. Not with certainty, but with clarity. So as we move out of Christmas, back into ordinary times, the Christmas tree comes down, stories fade. This one question will continue to remain. If Jesus came to us first as a refugee child, what does it mean to follow him now? Not in theory, not in those slogans, not in the bumper stickers, but in practice. May we have the courage to let this story unsettle us. The humanity to learn from those who live, whose lives echo it today. And the faith to remember that the gospel was never meant to make us comfortable, but to make us human again. Amen. Gracious, loving God, let us be reminded of what Jesus and his family went through. The feeling of being in a foreign land, of being other, of being